Well, great power rivalry is certainly a great topic. Most appropriate that we are addressing this issue now, given what is happening around the world. But I suppose if you look back, no matter how far you look back, there has always been some sort of great power rivalry. There's always one country somewhere that wants to do better than any others, and go back to the Greeks and the Romans if you like. Well, we are lucky to hear that we have some incredible people here. This is a AAA-rated panel. One academic, two ambassadors. I'm pleased that they are here, and I'm pleased that they're all able to contribute to you. Robert Patman, of course, Professor of International Relations beside me. Rosemary Banks, whom I've known for, probably 30 years. I can say one of our New Zealand's most successful and hard-working ambassadors wherever she has been. And as you know, she was just recently returned from Washington, D.C., which was quite a challenging time for any ambassador in Washington, D.C. During the Trump years. And then, of course, we're lucky to have Ambassador Tom Udall here. Aristocratic, New Mexico, Democratic family. And I'm old enough to remember when his father was Secretary of the Interior to President Kennedy, and that's a few years ago. So that tells you a little bit about someone who knows a lot and will be of tremendous benefit to us in this discussion tonight. Well, the world never stands still. Slow changes occur, and we've noticed that in China in the last 10 or 15 years. And then you get the rapid changes that have occurred in Europe and Ukraine and Russia in more recent times. Every one of these changes requires countries to look and decide where they fit in. Well, the Indo Pacific that we now frame our talks around, which is as much where we want to talk about tonight, is worthy of quite a bit of comment. So I've decided to ask Robert Patman to, academics have a great credentials that they can see the big picture, they can break down the big picture, but they can put us all in the frame which we can really benefit from tonight. So, Professor, over to you.
Thanks, Don, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the Aspen team. I'm delighted to be here, and it's been a tremendous day so far. I prepared about 3 minutes worth of remarks, and as Don said, I'm just try and set the scene, look at this intensified US-China rivalry in particular, because I think they are the two major great powers of our era, and trying to set it in some sort of context. The intensification of US-China rivalry is very real and has been gradually escalating in the period following the financial crisis of 2008-2009. Indications of this trend include growing Chinese assertiveness in relation to the South China Sea region, US-China trade tensions, particularly during the Trump administration, China's toughening stance towards Hong Kong and Taiwan, the advent of AUKUS. This is a strategic alliance between the United States, the UK and Australia, which is designed to try and uphold the international rules-based system, order, I should say, in the Indo Pacific region, and growing US tensions over Putin's Ukraine invasion. Beijing has accused the United States and NATO of fueling the fire in the Ukraine conflict, with the US and EU both warning China that that China's lucrative export markets in the EU and the US will be threatened if Beijing provides arms to Putin's invading forces in Ukraine. So does this increasing rivalry between the United States and China signal a new Cold War in global politics in the 21st century? The answer is no. The post-Cold War era is fundamentally different from the period between 1947 and 1989. And what I mean by fundamental difference, during the Cold War, we had rival global economic systems. We didn't have one truly authentic global economy as we do today. And also there was competing military alliance systems such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now these features, NATO of course has survived the passing of the Cold War, but there is no, if you like, counterweight against NATO. So these features of the Cold War simply do not exist in the globalizing world of the 21st century. China's rise to superpower status, and I want to emphasize this point because it's often lost, has been based on full-blooded participation in the global capitalist economy. And China's dependence on key markets like America, the European Union, and Japan is very real. Japan's trade reached 760 billion with the United States in 2022 and 747 billion with the EU in 2022. At the same time, the global significance of US-China rivalry in the 21st century, the global significance of this rivalry, should not be exaggerated. Many of the key problems facing states today, whether they be superpowers, middle powers, or small states, many of the challenges facing these states, all of them, are too big to be solved by superpowers acting alone or collectively with another, if there was suddenly collaboration broke out between the United States and China, they would still need active cooperation with other states to solve challenges like climate change, COVID-19, transnational terrorism, and the functioning of an expanded global economy. All of these problems do not respect borders and can only be effectively addressed through international cooperation. It should not be forgotten that during the post-Cold War era, it's difficult to point to successful unilateral actions by great powers. The United States' illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003 turned out to be, according to many American commentators, including a Republican one I came across, a strategic disaster. China's construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea, as it tried to flex its muscles as a rising superpower, alarmed many of its neighbours and served to bolster the network of US security alliances with the likes of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And the Putin's regime of Ukraine has had catastrophic results for Moscow. In essence, we are living through a prolonged and turbulent international transition in which a relentless increase in interconnectivity, and I do not see this trend being reversed, is diminishing the prospect of global dominance or global hegemony by two superpowers. Let me just wrap up and finish. The 21st century is presenting new opportunities in this context for small and middle powers to exert more agency and influence on global politics. It's not because the great powers are weaker, they're stronger than ever. It's just that the problems we face cannot, by definition, be solved by anything other than widespread international cooperation. However, the question is, will small powers like New Zealand and middle powers like Australia, are they willing to step out of their comfort zone and play a greater leadership role and take on more responsibility in international affairs? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and that sets a framework that we can all develop. And I hasten to add, we're not here to try and get a solution. We're not here to set up a plan of action. We're here to sort of all inform ourselves and widen our thinking as to something that's happening around us, which is pretty relevant to for the next 20 years. But the main thing is to understand it before we leap in with great ideas. Now, Rosemary, I think you could follow on from Robert there and pick up. You've been watching the Indo Pacific from Washington, D.C., you've known it from Wellington, you've known it from Canberra, and from the UN.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks to Aspen for this opportunity to join a conversation on a truly important topic. To answer the question that's posed up there, yes, great power rivalry is back. And Robert's right, the 21st century has put different characteristics around it, but I'm also going to argue that there's some depressingly continuous elements that do remind those of us old enough to remember the Cold War, what it was like. Once again, we've got military and technological competition. We've got a contest between worldviews, different ideologies, a closed society, authoritarianism against openness and democracy. Actually, I think I can quote him accurately. President Biden put this very starkly and emphatically in the introduction to the US National Security Strategy that was published last October. And he said, autocrats are working overtime to undermine democracy and to export a model of governance that is marked by repression at home and coercion abroad. So I think that's, those are pretty stirring words on the current situation as read from DC. Those in the realist school of foreign policy will assert that the US and China are already locked in a new Cold War, but that's not necessarily determinative. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said on a number of occasions that competition itself doesn't necessarily lead to conflict, although we can all see that when things go wrong, it can. So, question for us tonight is, where does that leave New Zealand? Well, interestingly, for the first time in our history, in a region that is seeing a playing out of geostrategic tension and great power competition in a way that we haven't seen it until now in the Indo Pacific. Now, just, why does that matter to us? We're at the far end of the Indo Pacific, but 70% of our trade is with other countries in the Indo Pacific. So for economic reasons alone, this is existentially important for New Zealand that we manage to retain stability in the region. Talking about definitions, we used to talk about New Zealand as in the Asia Pacific, and in the recent years that's kind of morphed along with this concept of the Indo Pacific, which stretched the notion, the regional definition out to include India. And then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in a speech in 2021 acknowledged, I think openly for the first time, that New Zealand saw the Indo-Pacific as our wider home and ourselves in that, I think as she put it, wider ecosystem of nations. And we've also enunciated 5 important principles that we hope to see respected in the Indo-Pacific. Importantly for us, for our trade, freedom of navigation and overflight, consistency with international law, open trade and investment, respect for sovereignty, and transparency in foreign policy, like what does a country plan to do in relation to another. Well, those are all high-minded and fine aspirations, but when we look into real life, what do we see? We actually see China either breaking or challenging most of those rules and norms. And we can unpick that more. But not all is doom and gloom in the Indo-Pacific, far from it. There are also good moves and good developments that are bringing countries into a tighter net of cooperation. One of the recent initiatives was US-led, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which should serve, and it's well underway now, to bring our economic integration more closely. Also part of our Indo-Pacific are our Pacific Island neighbours. So I hope our conversation tonight will also focus on what does great power competition mean if you're a small island state in the middle of the Pacific. But the most important question for me in front of all of us is, how does New Zealand position itself in this new geostrategic context? How do we frame and explain to others, and indeed to ourselves, our foreign policy? For decades we've talked about having an independent foreign policy. What does that mean now? Also, what is our brand, if you like, or our reputation in the Indo Pacific? And what is the offer that we bring to the table to help keep our region safe, secure, and open? So a lot of big questions there, and I'm just going to leave them tantalisingly hanging in the air for the ambassador to pick up.
Good idea. Good idea. Well, thank you, Rosemary. And I know one thing that we all do want to think about, and it's too easy to bypass, are the Pacific Islands. They cover a huge area of the Pacific.
Yeah.
They're all very weak economies, easily influenced in different directions, as we've seen. Mm-hmm. Tom, Washington, D.C. looks at this huge Pacific. Your people spent a huge amount of time here during World War II. You're watching it all the time. Japan-US relationship. The Japan-US security relationship is one of the long-running pins to hold this planet together. But anyway, let's hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Don. And let me just start. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Start by expressing my incredible, heart-rending feeling about Cyclone Gabriel and what's happened. And I just want to recognize that. I mean, we've been trying to help in ways we can with New Zealand. As Rosemary knows, there's a great partnership there. Some of the satellite imaging has helped with the damaged area, and we're trying to do everything we can that New Zealand requests. So we feel that we're very strong partners in many areas. And one of the areas to mention at the beginning, before I jump into the Indo Pacific and how both of these folks have laid it out, is what happened with Russia's invasion. We just had 1 year ago, and many of the diplomatic corps went out to the wharf at Wellington and stood there at dawn because we wanted to make the point that it's been 1 year and this ought to end. And New Zealand's Attorney General showed up, spoke on behalf of New Zealand, said very strong words. We heard from Ukrainians about what happened there. So this is something that I think is going on while we're all talking about it. We're at war, and the PRC actually just had their person in Russia standing with Putin and saying, the guy that's the equivalent of their foreign minister, saying we have an unconditional partnership. And as you've said, Robert, it's very important that we set down some lines as to how far they're going to go in terms of helping with this incredibly horrible invasion of Ukraine and all the life that's been lost over there. So I wanted to first of all, what do we seek? And we may get in later to the idea of rivalry. I think we're more strategic competitors. We don't want to hold China back from doing the things it's done for its people. We don't want to block any country. We want countries to follow the rules that are on the books and behave themselves and work with each other in a way that the example is a free and open, secure, peaceful, prosperous Pacific. That's what we're seeking. And so any characterization that we're out there for conflict, that we're out there trying to get in a war, that we're even trying to build up a Cold War, I don't think that's where we're headed. But I think there are some very, very serious issues. One of you said to me this evening, all of us should be very honest about where there are honest differences and speak up. And I think that's the case for small countries, Robert, whether medium-sized countries or whether from larger countries. And so that's one of the things that we're hoping to do in this region, is stand up with like-minded partners and people that care about democracy and care about the international rules order, care about international law, and joining together and say, let's all of us work together for these goals that I just outlined for the free and open Indo-Pacific. we've seen a real change, and Robert mentioned this. There's been an acceleration since about 2012, 2013 with the PRC in this region. And many of the things that they've done, and this has been under the leadership, the new leadership, and it's about 10 years or so in, of Xi Jinping. And what we've seen is a very accelerated kind of aggressiveness in the region, whether it's in the South China Sea, as Rosemary mentioned, where New Zealand stepped up with others and said, we're going to go through the strait and we're going to let everybody know this is international water and we're not going to stand for those kinds of things, and spoke up. We have seen that there have been steps taken where international rules, whether it's in the economic arena, whether it's in the foreign policy area, they're not being followed by one of the big players in this region. And we believe it's very important for democracies to stand up and say, let's get on the same page about this. And New Zealand has been an incredible partner for us. And I think there are many cases where New Zealand over the last 10 years has spoken up, has weighed the factors. Clearly, it's very, very important for New Zealand to have trade. And the thing that I've studied about New Zealand, your middle class is built out of trade. I mean, you really incredibly over the last 50 years had such fertile soil and fisheries and all of that, and being able to export that. And a lot of those exports up until 1989 were to the UK. Then when the UK went into the European Union, you had to find other markets, and we want you to do that. We want you to be out there. But we also believe that folks need to stand up with what is going on. And so I think the final word that I would put here is that like-minded democracies should stand up and speak out and take action when they see things that are in violation of international law and that are in a very real way disrupting the international rules of order that are out there, that everybody knows and that everybody understands. So back to you, Don.
Some very good points there. And I was going to ask Robert Patman to comment on the thought that are we seeing a trend where democracies will coalesce and autocracies will coalesce and in defense of their own actions usually, and will there be much of a crossover given where things are now?
Well, that's one of the interesting things was before the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Mr. Putin's authoritarian regime, which occurred, of course, on the 24th of February last year. Before that occurred, there was a concern within the Western world that things like disinformation and some disenchantment with some liberal democracies to deliver results for their populations. There were fears amongst some people, some scholars and some diplomats and some observers that democracy was losing its way. But the interesting thing was that the invasion, I think, has led to a resurgence of a recognition of the importance of liberal democracy. The shocking scenes we've seen from Ukraine, war crimes, the shocking behavior of Putin's Russia in the Ukraine has not only strengthened NATO with Sweden and Finland wanting to join, but I think has also brought home to people who may have been skeptical, who may have been tempted by some of the attraction of populism. I think that, what we've had during this period, not only the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, but we've also seen a series of populist leaders who have not been able to walk the talk. It's all very well when you're in opposition saying, if you vote for me, it's all going to be wonderful. and you can tell a few fairy tales, but when you get into power, that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult. And I think Mr. Johnson's departure in the UK, after failing to deliver on a number of fronts, and also I think Mr. Trump's defeat in the 2020 election, although I recognise that America is deeply polarised at the moment, and also Mr. Bolsonaro's defeat. I think that liberal democracy has many things going for it and will endure. I think the authoritarian regimes in both China and Russia, let's be quite clear, time is not necessarily on their side. And I don't say that because in a triumphalist way that, the strength of freedom and democracy will prevail. I think we are in the fourth decade of this technological revolution that's been unleashed from the development of the microchip, technologically fueled globalization. It's making it increasingly difficult for authoritarian regimes to tell their people what they should think. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to see the crumbling of authoritarian regimes overnight, but I do think that democracies are best placed to adapt to the changing world which we find ourselves in the 21st century. So I do not see liberal democracy in retreat. But what we've got to do in liberal democracies, and this is a responsibility, of course, that goes beyond liberal democracies, but is try to make the global economy work better for more people. Because let's be quite clear, one of the reasons authoritarians and some of their populist supporters, I've noticed this nice, neat convergence between some of these populist leaders and their empathy for leaders like Putin, is based on the fact they have exploited grievances within their society. And in a sense, it's all easy to rail against populist leaders. But the most important and constructive thing to do is try to remove some of the grievances and strengthen liberal democracy so it's less vulnerable to some of the extremism that we see.
Can I just pick up on a couple of Robert's points? Just been reading, and I haven't even finished reading it, so I'm on a slightly wobbly platform here, but in the latest Foreign Affairs Review, the pale blue publication that comes out of the US Council on Foreign Relations, there's an article on this very point by Samantha Power, who was a former ambassador at the UN, written a lot on human rights, and she now heads the US Development Agency, USAID. And she was basically saying, look, we're not out of the woods yet with saving democracy, that if we are to do so properly, we've got to do it differently. And it was exactly Robert's last point. She said, in the past, in advocating democracy, we've over-focused on rights and individual freedoms, etc., and we've overlooked the pain and the hardship of economic change and all the forces of technological development that have left that whole class of people stranded and therefore vulnerable to populism. She does cite some Pew surveys, I think, that shows that populist leaders overall have lost about 10 points of support, largely because of their not so good performance during the pandemic. But without having finished the article, I think she's really saying, yeah, we've got a turning point here, but we're not out of it. We've still got to deliver a better kind of democracy.
Don, and I would just say as someone that comes from the political side, and I'm a non-career ambassador, and I served as my state attorney general and served 22 years in the House and the U.S. Senate, that your point about taking grievances seriously is what every democracy does, as I've observed. I was on the foreign relations, I traveled the world for those 22 years, and you can look at the problems and that the United States has, the polarization that Robert talked about. I'm not here to tell you that we don't make mistakes. The United States makes mistakes, there's no doubt about it. But we try to respond to what our people are saying and what grievances they have, what problems they have, and what they see in terms of fairness and inequality and things going on in society. And my final comment there has to do with something that's very precious here in New Zealand that you have, because you don't have the polarization right now. You have some of the things that stir it up, the misinformation, disinformation. You're seeing things just since the 16 months that Jill and I have been here where things are getting stirred up. But you have this trust in your government, and you should nurture that. You should nurture that, and you should work with your elected officials to see that they stick to the grievances and stick to the issues and get things done. Because to me, that's what you want out of your government. And your leaders may be saying things that are unpopular, but hear them out, listen to them, and then speak up if you don't agree. But you have a wonderful feeling here that I've got in the last 16 months that really moves you forward in many of the areas I talked about: inequality, fairness, and doing the best by all of society.
Well, it's right. Democracies can only be sustained if the people believe that they will continue to deliver. You might not get every decision right, but as long as people feel they are being heard or listened to, they'll give it a chance. The autocracy eventually shuts down those noisy machines that cause aggravation to a government. And it comes a little bit, Rosemary, I come back to our friends in the South Pacific, those very vulnerable economies, how so easily, look, I spend a lot of time in Africa watching China, watching other big players. We'll build you a stadium, we'll build you a hotel, we'll do this, we'll do that. It never actually bought the people, but they got what they wanted in the meantime. But the thing is, it swings the political pendulum in that area.
Just on that point, in the Pacific, I think one of the things that is really concerning, I mean, I was posted in the Pacific a long time ago, in the Solomon Islands, and they are particularly vulnerable. As we saw last year, they signed a security agreement with China, which could potentially allow China to use the Solomons as a military base or foothold in the Pacific. But, you know, last June, okay, so coming up 9 months or so ago, in Washington, we had what we always have each year, a gathering of the Pacific ambassadors who are mostly based in New York. And of course, this topic came up, you know, how to deal, we're all struggling with this, all of us, how to deal with the relationship with China. And as one of the ambassadors said to the group, look, if we've got a lot of development needs and China comes along and says, we can do this for you, and we as the government were to say, oh, no thanks, we don't trust your offer, then how would we explain that to our people? And this is the conundrum that we've really got in the Pacific, because China has set out really to do very effective elite capture, which they've been doing for some decades, and we haven't been doing it particularly well. But the Pacific governments haven't really felt, in a lot of cases, that they had choices. Now, I think all of our governments are now trying to fill in that gap, you know, say, look, we've got to have a new kind of engagement, a new kind of partnership, a new permanent listening to what they're saying and what they're telling us they need. And of course, climate change in the Pacific is right top of that list. So both New Zealand and Australia, and now the United States, have really tried to reframe that relationship with Pacific governments more on a footing of equals, but, you know, more on a footing of giving them choices so that they don't feel there's no other option but to accept some offer which later they may regret and find it had a lot of thorny bits on it they didn't recognise at first. But it's a tough one.
It is. Robert, why don't you just talk a little bit about these new architectural structures in the Pacific, AUKUS, the Quads, etc., all changing in the last 15 years.
Yes, there was quite a bit of controversy in New Zealand when AUKUS was announced in September 2021. I think a number of commentators here said, why isn't New Zealand part of this grouping? And this strategic alliance is designed, as I said in my opening remarks, to try to uphold the international rules-based order in the Indo Pacific. I think, in a sense, New Zealand would find it difficult to be a member of that grouping, particularly they have a lot in common. New Zealand has a lot in common, for obvious reasons, with the three countries concerned. But New Zealand is very strong on its non-nuclear security policy. ASEAN, a 10-nation grouping, 9 members of that share that vision, and they have also signed up to a treaty, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, which has about, I think, 54 or 55 countries have signed up to. New Zealand played a leadership role in getting that treaty on the books. So there's some reasons why New Zealand wouldn't necessarily like to be part of AUKUS, because it includes the provision, it envisages that Australia will obtain nuclear power submarines within 18 months. But I think there's another reason, and that is, and I think the point was brought out by a former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who's not been very happy with Australia signing this agreement. That is that New Zealand has a strategic need to diversify its trade. And some of the biggest critics of this formation have been countries in the region which actually have very great concerns about Chinese expansion, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia. They are not particularly keen on AUKUS, and yet these are the sort of markets that New Zealand needs to be looking to if it wants to reduce its very high level of dependence on the Chinese market. So in a sense, New Zealand also has, I think, a slightly different worldview. It shares a lot with the countries in question, but I think New Zealand doesn't just want to uphold the existing rules-based order, it actually wants to strengthen it. What do I mean by strengthening the rules-based international order? I'm talking about reform of the UN Security Council. And that is a key long-term goal of New Zealand, since going back to the Fraser days, and we haven't had too much movement. But President Zelensky, when he addressed the UN Security Council, looked them in the eye and said, "You failed us. You were set up to present yourself as an obstacle to one member of the United Nations invading another, but you didn't. The UN Security Council is dysfunctional." So in a sense, I think we're not part of AUKUS, but we have very close relations with the members of AUKUS, but we're one of 20 countries which has a high level of trade dependence on China, and we need to change that. We have about a 31%, I think, Don, at the moment, 31% of our agricultural products are going to China. That's good at one level, but it also has political implications when dealing with an authoritarian regime. So I think that New Zealand's ambitious to diversify within the Indo Pacific region. AUKUS might be seen as an obstacle to doing that. And so I think that's another concern, but I've probably spoken enough, so I hope that sort of kicked things off a bit, Don.
No, well, I think it's filling those gaps as to how New Zealand can manoeuvre itself.
Yep.
I was about to have a certain opinion, then I realised I was appointed to the government's review of defence strategy just before Christmas. So if I say anything off course, I'll end up with Rob Campbell in purgatory somewhere. But I'll take my chances.
Be careful of that Public Service Commission. They're strong. You should be proud of them too.
Wasn't around in my day, I don't think.
Can I just have a quick correction before the ambassador speaks on? Robert, you're saying Zelensky said to the UN Security Council, "You, the Council, have failed us." No, Russia and China failed Ukraine.
Yeah.
Not the Council.
No, but he said that what he said, if you read his words, was he said he reserves the right after the conflict to lead a campaign to reform the Security Council.
Well, good luck with that one.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I
if
spent
anybody's...
3 years of my life trying to do that.
I know, but if you've just had your country experience $500 billion worth of infrastructure damage and you've been the victim of war crimes, I think, and given the fact that the majority of countries in the United Nations want reform of the Security Council, I think Zelensky may be pushing on an open door, if he's still leader. No. But the key point is that you're absolutely right that Russia and China have abused their position in the UN Security Council. It's disgraceful. But unfortunately, you know, and I'm not point scoring here, but a number of China, Russia did it, and unfortunately, they cited the example of the US in 2003. Now, it doesn't, you know, I'm not condoning Russia or China, but I'm saying that it would be great if all UN Security Council members consistently used the veto with considerable restraint, as it was originally intended.
That's right. Don, could I just say one point on trade that's been raised here? Because I think there's something to say in New Zealand's favor. You've had a leader here the last 6 years that's tried to do something about this in a significant way in terms of dependence on China. And, you know, in a democracy where you have businesses doing the trade, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said very specifically to businesses, traveled around New Zealand and told them, you know, we're overly dependent. We need to diversify. And she did it in a, I think it's very brave for a prime minister to go and tell the major businesses that kind of message and consistently have it and put it out there. And then the next 2 points have to do with traveling internationally and getting a trade agreement with the UK, which the young man here from the UK embassy tells me the trade's going to increase 60%. As a result of the UK agreement, and then get a trade agreement with the European Union, which is being worked through now. So democracies can stand up and do the right thing, and you had a good example of that by your last prime minister on that issue of getting too dependent and trying to persuade business and persuade society as a whole. We need to try to diversify.
It's a very good point, and I can tell you this from one time being a foreign minister, that our trade negotiators are some of the most skilled people we've got in our government, because they're always working uphill. They're always working against a country much bigger than ourselves, but their maneuverability around some of the most amazing trade deals in the world has been legendary. But yes, I agree on the China bit, is given that it was China that actually pulled us through the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, the sheer volume of money that they paid us through that time. But, as Robert says, 31% is too high dependency, particularly in that situation. All right, where does that take us to, Robert? You're the lecturer, you're the professor.
I was just reflecting on what you were saying, Don. I also think, and I'd be interested to hear what, you know, Tom and Rosemary say on this, but I think when we signed that free trade agreement, I think New Zealand was the first developed country to sign a free trade agreement with China in 2008. Yeah. And then followed not long after by Australia. When we signed that agreement, China was a very different country.
It was.
Absolutely.
And that's something that's often lost. China has had a cumulative enhancement of consciousness in terms of its military and economic capabilities since then. And I think a turning point was, you know, I absolutely agree with what Don's saying. China, in many respects, came through the global financial crisis unscathed, and that was good news for much of the global economy. And actually, if China really wanted to disestablish the world capitalist system, it had a wonderful opportunity, but it collaborated, I understand, largely with the United States through the global financial crisis because China has such a huge stake in it. So, but there were trends from about late 2009, a hardening view within China, and Xi Jinping, since he's been in power, he was already prominent before he became, the most paramount leader in China. there were indications that he had a more China-centric view, a view in which China's national interests had to be more assertively pushed. And I think that was an enormous disappointment, not only to many democracies. I mean, let's be quite clear. The reason that China has become a superpower, as I said in my opening remarks, is because many Western countries supported China's integration into the global economy.
Actively encouraged.
Actively encouraged, because it was based on the assumption that China would gradually become a good international citizen, would liberalize its approach to international relations, and perhaps mellow domestically, become a little less intolerant of opposition. But none of those expectations have been fulfilled, and that lack of frustrated expectations has come into sharp focus with Xi Jinping's rule, which in many respects is a bit of a throwback to the 1970s in the sense of centralization and also this approach that Cold War talk. The Chinese leadership is constantly accusing the European Union and the United States of engaging in Cold War rhetoric, when in fact these countries are largely pointing out some of the human rights failings of the Chinese leadership. So I found that all very sobering. The question is, and I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues feel here, whether this currently China-centric sort of very realpolitik approach being taken by China will continue in the future. And I think, the jury seems to be out on that at the moment.
I think I've got a pessimistic view on that. I think we've seen enough of a confirmed trend line really, that it's going to continue. I think, Robert mentioned the importance of the 2008 global financial crisis, and that seems to be what a lot of commentators now read as the point at which China said, okay, the US is permanently weaker, we don't need to worry so much anymore, and we're going to assert ourselves. We don't have to do the Deng Xiaoping, hide and divide approach anymore. We're going to go for dominance. And, to me, one of the turning points was the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, what you hear referred to as BRI. That's when China, used this new kind of construct to go out and expand its network globally, to get countries resources, to get them into debt, to get them into their sphere, just like the old kingdoms of pre-communist China. And, ever since then, I think we've seen that that's where Xi Jinping's head is. He's publicly announced, as you know, that he wants, China to be a dominant power by 2049. I don't see him looking backwards. And this kind of, getting Russia into a position of thraldom or, what do you call it? There's a special word that the Chinese use, vassal state kind of thing, is all part of it. So, I think China's going to continue to be a serious challenge for New Zealand to manage. I mean, I think as the ambassador said, Prime Minister Ardern put out some very clear messages in a number of speeches through 2021 and 2022, warning, as you said, Ambassador, the business community that if China decides to turn against New Zealand the way they had against Australia, the government would not be able to protect them. They would have to be very conscious of that commercial risk. And I think that message hit home. And at the same time, she put out those very clear statements that we'd work with China where we could on global issues like climate change, where we all know we need China's cooperation. But there would be a number of other areas, significantly human rights, where we could not agree and we would not agree. And I think Secretary of State's used very similar terminology, or maybe we used very similar terminology to his. I should put it that way.
Don, could I jump in here a second? Because this is on the issue of, is China going to continue in the same direction? And specifically on the biggest issue we face, which is climate change. And here you have the two biggest economies in the world, PRC and the United States. And if they can't cooperate on climate change and get their act together and show the rest of the world that they're going to move forward together and they're going to lay out what they're going to do, and they're going to have, as was articulated in the recent COP, have nationally determined goals that we're going to meet, then we're in really deep trouble. And to have the PRC do something along the line where Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan, and then China say, we aren't talking anymore about climate, we've completely put it on hold. And they've done this a couple of times in the last couple of years, puts us all in a situation where we're getting deeper and deeper in a hole. And if we can't come together and cooperate and motivate the rest of the world to do it, we're digging the hole deeper, and we're starting to see and have been seeing in the last couple of decades the kind of damage it can do. So that's, for me, more of a plea to say, come on, let's look at the big issues and let's get together on them and really move forward in a decisive way.
And one would think, you know, and I've watched this for many years now, and we watched China opening up from Deng Xiaoping to Li Peng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, and they kept on. They also pulled 500 million people out of poverty. So you've got a huge middle class in China who most have traveled the world now. They've probably got 2 apartments in a major city. There's, 300,000 Chinese students in the United States studying. I'm just wondering how long they can be constrained in that rigid Xi Jinping for more than a decade, probably.
Don, if I could just come in on this very interesting point. With regard to China and the other authoritarian state, Russia, the big players, one of the interesting things was, and I picked this up for over the last 5 years, is that they both, China and Russia, one of the common, I mean, there's lots of differences between them. I've always thought it was a marriage of convenience, really. It's against the United States and the EU more than anything in geopolitical terms. But one of the things that brought them together was this narrative that the West is failing. Mr. Putin got it, and I think the Chinese did to some degree, got it into their heads. When I say the Chinese, I mean the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping and Putin, both got it into their heads that the West was declining, that liberal democracy no longer had the stomach for protracted ideological struggle. And I think what really shocked them was the reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I think this is a tremendous shock to the Chinese leadership. And now they're really conflicted. What we're witnessing at the moment is the Chinese leadership deeply conflicted. Their nightmare scenario is for Putin's regime to collapse, because it's not the heavenly great attachment to Vladimir Putin per se, but they worry about the example of an authoritarian regime which reaches for a national goal in a neighbouring country and fails. They realise that that would probably work against their interests internationally, not least in relation to Taiwan. But secondly, I think the other side of that coin is, I believe, in a one-party state, it's tempting to think that Xi Jinping represents everyone's views. I believe there are ambitious Chinese politicians in the ruling central committee who will, if, for example, I don't think it's going to happen, and here I agree with Rosemary, I don't think the Chinese are foolish enough to arm, I may be wrong, arm the Putin's army in Ukraine. But if they took that step, that could be a decisive blow for the Chinese economic system. Because make no mistake about it, and I think many Chinese leaders understand this, their rise to power has depended on, performing very well in large Western markets, such as the United States and the EU. And in a sense, the Chinese now find themselves in a bind. They want to support Putin, but they also know, should they go ahead with that step, they will undermine the economy of their own country. And from Xi's point of view, he's laying himself open to rivals within the leadership. Because if the economy begins to decline in China, then that has political ramifications for the legitimacy of the monopoly of political power exercised by the Communist Party.
Very good.
Can I just say, we're I think, running fast through our time, and nobody's picked up my big, hairy questions that I posed right at the beginning.
Oh, that we
So what kind of foreign policy,
5 more minutes and
etc.?
we're opening up to you. I can see you're all sitting on the edge of your seat with a question and ready to go. But
Because I'm sure if I asked, what do people understand by New Zealand's independent foreign policy, there'd probably be as many answers as there are people in this room. And, I noticed in a speech that Prime Minister Ardern gave at one point, she said, our independent foreign policy has never meant that we wanted or that we expected to achieve our objectives on our own. You see, we're very good at saying what our independent foreign policy doesn't do, but we're not so good at saying what it does. So I'm trying to work out, what is a positive expression of that? And so if I were forced, I'd probably come up with something like, and I'm waiting to hear from our former foreign minister on this, that we would abide in our foreign policy by international law and rule of law, that we would bring an independent analysis to issues, and that we would act in ways that are consistent with our values and our stated norms. And, there's doubtless many improvements on that, but anyway, is an independent foreign policy something that we should be talking about in this new geostrategic context, which is no longer the benign environment that Helen Clark talked about 20 plus years ago? Does that serve us well, or is it just confusing? What I've said kind of puts a good, nice, respectable face to it. But maybe as others see it, it just means that they don't know whether they can count on New Zealand or not. What does independent mean? Are we going to come to the party, but, like that brilliant line that Churchill had of the US, that they'll do the right thing when they've exhausted all the other options?
It's right. No, it's right. I get quite cynical about this one because I've seen many people campaigning in many countries. We will have an independent foreign policy. No one actually knows what it is.
No,
it just
exactly.
sounds kind of good in your own country when you're trying to differentiate yourself from the opposition. I watched one British politician campaign, we're going to have an ethical foreign policy.
Right.
Well, he came into office and that lasted about 10 minutes. And that was all gone. So it's pretty much a label. You can make of it what you want, really. And it's kind of handy to have, look, if you're a small country, you can't be saying our foreign policy will always be alongside Australia, always alongside the United States, or whoever. You can't say that politically when you're campaigning in your own country. You've got to show that you do think of these things a little bit differently.
Robert's busting to...
Yeah, well, I have been pondering Rosemary's excellent question. And it seems to me that New Zealand, its international standing has gone up quite significantly in the last 5 years. Through events which were not, through circumstances largely, and our response to those, Jacinda Ardern's response, the response of the Jacinda Ardern-led government, I should say, to the Christchurch terror atrocity. I think that impressed a number of people internationally. It was a combination of empathy, but a willingness to take decisive action. And also, particularly the first year response to COVID-19 contrasted somewhat with the response of the UK and the United States. I know the response has changed a lot under Mr. Biden, but in the first year under Mr. Trump wasn't as impressive as it could have been. I think New Zealand has shown, so it's got an opportunity to influence more than it did previously. And one example of bottom-up multilateralism, and that's what I think, this is where I think is the opportunity for New Zealand. Don's absolutely right. We have to work with others. But I think an independent foreign policy can mean that you work with like-minded countries. They may be middle powers, they may be superpowers, in launching an initiative. Let me give you an example of what I think may be a model for New Zealand to pursue. After the Christchurch terror atrocity, Jacinda Ardern got together with Emmanuel Macron, the French leader, and they launched the initiative to curb online extremism. Strikingly, the Trump administration didn't support that initiative. In the past, that might have killed it. The United States saying no. But in the interconnected world where so many other countries share this concern about online extremism, with quite a few countries came forward and supported it. And when the Biden administration came to power, one of the early things it did was to support the initiative. And to me, this is an example of New Zealand and a middle power actively collaborating with no support from the administration of the day in Washington, the Trump administration, and nevertheless getting international support. So I don't think we have to be passive, but I do think that's an opportunity. I mean, to put it in a nutshell, I think an independent foreign policy is a willingness to use the opportunities of an increasingly interconnected world where ideas have much wider circulation than before, and where New Zealand has a reasonable reputation because it's seen as a country which has no real axe to grind compared with many others. And it's to use that credibility in a constructive way to work with others, middle powers, and if necessary, the United States, superpowers, to achieve real progress. And I think, in a sense, I do think, and I agree with what Tom said, I do think the previous Prime Minister, and I think the present Prime Minister, will stand firm in rejecting what I call master-servant relationships with authoritarian states. And I think that's very important. We must be true to the ideas that Kiwis, people in this country, our values.
The ability to take that sort of soft power and do creative things with it rests on the quality of our ideas. And I'll just throw out a little compliment here to the students that Robert and I met today, because based on our encounter with them, the quality of our ideas in future is going to be still top-notch. So good on you, students. Keep at it.
And his point on very, very good point in terms of what was done internationally. I mean, this misinformation, disinformation on the internet is one of the big issues of our time, and one of the ones that is part of undermining democracy. And New Zealand not only did it internationally, but has done it, and Australia has done it, tried to do legislation in this tough area and try to lead out and say, what kind of laws and regulation do we need to put in place to make sure that doesn't ruin our democracies and undermine our democracies?
Yep. The rule of law. The rule of law underpins it all. All right, let's open up. This is your chance to ask a question. There may be a number of you who want to make a long speech. You won't be allowed to.
Filibuster.
Yes, so we're looking for, we've got David, you started off last time, so I'm going to ask someone else. Alistair, here we go.
Alistair.
You could say your name.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everyone. I'm Alistair Crozier, Executive Director of the New Zealand-China Council. Thanks for a great panel discussion. I think it's fair to say it probably was a weighting on one particular side of the issue, and I think many of the issues, there are other perspectives that could be raised, but Christine has said to keep it very short. So my question is, if we take the view that US and other countries in the region are trying to do the right thing through the IPEF or through AUKUS, is it not ultimately self-defeating if China's not inside the tent? Because if you're trying to set up a green economy globally through IPEF, you can't do that with a country the size of China. It just won't work. If you're trying to have a prosperous region, arguably you can't do that without China as a huge economy, very connected to the rest of the region inside the tent. And if you're trying to have a peaceful region, how can you do that if you're trying to contain China. So I guess, yeah, the question is it not ultimately a waste of time if you don't try a different approach going down the track? Thank you.
Well, there's
You're the
a
owner
challenge,
of
Tom.
IPEF.
I think that the crux of your issue sets up that the United States trying to contain China and trying to hold China back. That's what I said at the beginning. We weren't trying to do that. I don't think our approach is to say we don't want China to bring and grow its middle class. We want them to be a partner in a rules-based international order. I think we're at the kind of yelling that at the top of our lungs, and saying, we want you in there. That was the original idea. If you go back to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, was to bring China in because we thought China could be such a key partner. And so I think the same feelings are there. It's very disturbing, and I think all of our panelists here have said the last 10 or 12 years, the direction we've seen China take. And then for these big issues that I talked about, climate change, misinformation, disinformation, to actually be moving in a very bad direction on those. And so that's where I come out. But I don't think we're looking for a conflict. I think, Australia on AUKUS they were working with France. They were always looking to try to step up in security in the region. It just so happened that the United States and the UK and Australia, 3 countries that have been very involved in the Pacific for a very long time, decided to do it in terms of the nuclear submarines. But I think it was done in terms of seeing the threat, and the very aggressive threat over the last 10 years.
Okay, where do we go from there?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Grace from Mokatabu High School, and my question is, if China was to assist Russia with invading Ukraine at the moment, how would New Zealand's economy be affected, and would we stop exporting to them, and what would happen?
Yeah,
Robert.
it's a very good question. And I think all parties hope that China will not take that step. I think the United States and the EU would probably be looking for New Zealand to show some solidarity in any sanctions being shown. And to be fair, I think New Zealand has a huge stake, actually bigger than many people recognise, I think, in this country, in Mr. Putin failing. Because as we said in our earlier remarks, small and middle-sized countries depend critically, this country depends critically, on an international rules-based order. I think about 29% of our GDP goes in agricultural exports, but we're not big enough or powerful enough to make our own rules. So therefore, we need a rules-based environment where transactions occur on the basis of rules, not power, in order to operate. And that's very, very important for us. So I think if Mr. Putin took that step, yes, that would have, I think it probably would have implications for our trade with China. And why? Because New Zealand has already made it clear in very stark terms, and Chris Hipkins has, if anything, toughened the line, that what Mr. Putin has done is unacceptable. He's ripped up the UN rulebook, which New Zealand has traditionally taken quite seriously. He's actually taken steps which are in contradiction to China's international position, which is respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. After all, their claims to Hong Kong and Taiwan are based on those principles. Mr. Putin has ripped that up. So I do think that if China armed Mr. Putin's army, we would have to respond in some shape or form if our partners in the EU and the United States took sanctions, I think there would be some pretty strong sanctions taken by those two countries, the EU and the United States.
Yeah, that would have to come to that.
Christine, there was a question. Christine, there's a question over here. Been trying to get you.
We've been waiting for Mr. Ralston's question.
Thanks. William Ralston. I'm a previous president of Federated Farmers and of the World Farmers Organization. And your question was exactly my question. So you've almost stolen my thunder. My question was going to be, if New Zealand had to take sides, particularly if China supplies lethal weapons to Russia, would we have to take sides? And if we did, would a free trade agreement with the United States help us make that decision? That was going to be my question. But that's rather a piece on the territory.
Okay, you made the speech, Bill. Go.
So still on a trade issue, we've seen a really strong coalition of the willing in response to the Ukrainian invasion. In what ways might that translate into better cooperation in terms of trade? And what sort of green shoots might we see to see that happening? And then I could add, would a free trade agreement with the United States actually be one of those green shoots?
Did you want?
Well, and Rosemary talked about this earlier. I mean, what the president has tried to do with a difficult domestic situation is step forward on an economic framework that's increasingly getting some flesh on it in terms of saying, we need a resilient supply chain, we need high labor standards, we need to do everything we can to be sustainable and work on climate in all these areas. And really, what we're framing is issues that we can all agree on, that we can work on, and maybe at some point lead to exactly what you're asking about. But it isn't. When I first arrived here, as someone who voted both sides of trade agreements based on my analysis of them, I thought, we could get a digital trade agreement here and get something going. One of the things, as Rosemary knows, when we were in Washington, probably a lot of people don't know this, but the Prime Minister Ardern handed the president and said, we can help you on that infant formula. And a few months later, actually, I think one of the companies was approved to import. I don't know where exactly that is, but the desire is there, the care for New Zealand and all of that. We're just going to have to work through all the problems.
But just
go.
Just adding to your question, about how do we position ourselves? I mean, not just the supply of weapons, but, eventually if China decides to take an active move against Taiwan, we will also have a very difficult decision to make. And, the New Zealand-born, now probably long forgotten, long dead, long-term Premier of Queensland, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, had a great line. He said, it's hard if you're sitting on the fence to have your ear to the ground at the same time. And there could be a foreign policy version of that.
Yeah. If I could add a footnote to your excellent question, I mean, I think there might be a hope if this scenario was played out where China armed Russia, there might be a hope that the United States would reconsider its opposition to participation in the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because I know that she's now out of office, but the former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, raised that issue repeatedly, and she was told, I understand, sorry, domestic politics get in the way. But if China armed Russia, that could influence the domestic debate within the United States. So I think one green shoot might be for the United States to drop its reservations about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I think many of the countries inside that arrangement do want the United States to be in it. And I think that would be good for the region.
But to come back to Alistair's question earlier about, well, why don't we actually recognise the reality and allow China to come into these organisations? This very year, the assessment of China's case to come into CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, is underway, isn't it? So that's going to be interesting.
So here is Tom Tusher, here is a very short, very open-ended question for you. How do we prevent a Cold War from becoming a hot war?
We're all looking at each other.
Actively promote democracies. Democracies do not go to war against each other. Yes.
Given the state of between democracies and autocracies, where it is today, how do we prevent that leading to open warfare?
Well, the one comment, and you all probably saw this in terms of focusing right on your issue, is when President Trump was speaking so much about China, at one point the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called his equivalent in China because he was hearing that they wanted to go to war right on the eve of the election. He thought it was going to happen. They were hearing that, and he did his duty and called and tried to settle the whole thing down. And my point is that we always want to be in discussions with China and talking about the difficult issues and at the table with them having those discussions, which also goes to some of the other questions here. We're not seeking conflict. We're a peaceful nation, but we've got to stand up and do what we think needs to be done to protect a rules-based order with our like-minded partners. But we got to keep the discussion going and the conversation going. And that's where it's very disturbing, where you have one incident like Speaker Pelosi, and they say, we're not going to talk to you for 3 or 4 months. I mean, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work for two powers to this extent.
Robert?
If I could just briefly address your very demanding question. I don't think we're in a Cold War situation. I think China's interests are actually much more broadly aligned with the United States than many people realize. There's a very good personal relationship between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. They know each other quite, and I think that Xi Jinping's been trying to have his cake and eat it, but he may be slowly realizing that he's got, like many political leaders, he's got to make difficult choices. And one difficult choice may be basically abandoning Putin. And that's possible. He would be wise to do that in light of China's long-term interests, given its structural links with the economies of the EU and the United States. He can't undo that. If he does, he will destroy his career. So he faces tough choices. That will be I think China has it within its grasp to resolve this situation by basically abandoning Putin. That may not be, very reassuring to Xi Jinping at the moment, but as I say, often politicians do have to make those sort of calls, and the moment is coming where he's going to have to make a tough choice. I think it was Edmund Burke once said, in political life, there's often a choice between the disagreeable and the intolerable. I think Xi's getting to that point now.
Robert, does the 12-point peace plan allow him to sort of say, okay, look, I've put out an exit ramp for you?
Yes, but you see, he's trying, again, Mr. Xi Jinping's leadership are trying to have their cake and eat it. They're trying to look like the peacemaker. But this is what I call a lot of froth, really, because actually, that, as the Ukrainians pointed out, it's siding. I mean, if you're an authentic peacemaker, you do not take sides. And it's quite clear that they're calling for Ukraine to reward Putin's aggression. They're being asked to give up territory. That's right. That's a non-starter, not least for the Ukrainian people. So the other interesting thing is, though, when Mr. Putin started, and he's been doing this a number of times, threatening to use nuclear weapons, China unceremoniously slapped him down. They said under no circumstances can nuclear weapons ever be used in Ukraine. So, we've had this partnership without limits, but I think there are real limits. And as I say, I think China, I think the peace initiative may be an attempt to convince some opinion in the West that China can come up with a solution that ends this awful situation, but protects China's political interests. I think good luck with that, because I don't think it's going to happen.
Next question, please. Two questions there. Oh, we're way back.
Peter Harris. Two really quick questions. One is, you haven't mentioned India, and I'm just interested in where they sit in the mix. And the other thing is, I'm really interested in the percentage chance you give of China invading Taiwan.
You want to go around the table, do you?
I think China will attempt to avoid invading, actually, in a direct and tactical way, but they'll do it by stealth, by sort of overtaking, through the economy, public attitudes, perhaps through disinformation campaigns. So the percentage likelihood that that'll be the end result, I think, is quite high. But the percentage likelihood of it being an actual invasion, I think, is, I would say, just totally guessing, less than 30%.
Yeah, I would think very low, I reckon.
We've got time for two more
Comments
questions.
on someone, India, do you want to say about it?
Yes.
Yeah, India is an interesting one. I was very disappointed by India's stance on the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, I think India wants to be, it wants to be part of Quad. Yeah. And the big first test comes along about upholding the rules-based order. Putin drives a coach and horses through it, and India said that's okay. Well, that's not leadership. And, because they have a long-term military relationship.
Yeah. And military supplies.
Yeah, with Russia. And given that India's participation in Quad is not so much about upholding the rules-based order, but against countering China, that was very disappointing, because I think many of us thought that India had the potential to make a constructive contribution. It is a democracy. It should be speaking out. It should be basically making it very clear to Mr. Putin that he's invaded a democratic country, and one which has given up nuclear weapons, by the way, and it's unacceptable. But India sat on the fence.
India disappoints regularly for many years.
Right. Well, we've got Susan, and then David. Do you still have a question still?
And the leader of India did say, this isn't the era for war. He should have acted upon it if he felt that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Susan Archer, and it's been a fabulous discussion. Thank you all very much indeed. I couldn't agree more with your Mr. McKinnon's urging that we need to stand up for democracy and really be more overt about that, but also within New Zealand as well. But we're struggling to do that at the moment, with arguments around things like co-governance and a minister telling us that we've got to get used to a new kind or a different kind of democracy. So what the hell is that? And we have arguments about the hate speech laws, which directly contravene a great deal about free speech, which is fundamental to democracy. So haven't we got some challenges to resolve within New Zealand first before we really go out and start telling the world about democracy?
Well, look, every country always has challenges. Sometimes if you haven't got big ones, you enlarge the little ones to beyond what they should be. The great thing is, every 3 years we decide whether we want to continue with this lot or have a new lot or a change. And there are pains in democracies at all times, but it sure is better than the alternative. There's the plurality of it is what really is the strength. There's so many people involved in the decision making in any sphere. That's the strength of democracies. It's always open. I always say, Putin could not have launched a war in Ukraine if he had an independent judiciary and an independent press. It just could not have happened.
And an independent parliament,
Yeah.
whatever you call it.
Thanks for coming here tonight. David GF, Great Power Rivalry, is it a revival or not? The opening remarks were about not, but I think everything we've heard since is very definitely there's power rivalry, and I don't think there's any doubt that there is two spheres of influence, very much driven by democracy versus autocracy. Would you agree with that? As summing up the discussion tonight, that there is actually quite a big power rivalry.
My opening remarks, if you recall, were that yes, we were, and it was actually quite a continuity in some respects from the Cold War.
Yeah, I think I slightly disagree with Rosemary on that. I think there's the reality, there's great power rivalry, no one disputes that. But rivalry over what? Because, as Tom indicated, some of the problems are so big, the rivals have to collaborate by definition in order to solve them. So there's not going to be a winner over climate change. Whoever prevails in the superpower struggle is not going to be able to magically turn around and say, right, now I can solve climate change. It's not going to happen. And kicking and screaming, we have to get away from a compartmentalized view of these problems and begin to address them at the global level. And it's a big change for all countries. So I think, yes, there is superpower rivalry, but hopefully there will be, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, there will be a maturing amongst the participants that they both need each other. And I think there is that recognition in the Biden administration. But I think Xi Jinping still thinks, to some degree, I don't think all Chinese leaders think this, that they can have their cake and eat it. They can have all the spoils of the capitalist market, but continue to be free to spread authoritarianism. And by the way, the spheres of influence argument, I don't really accept, because I don't see those countries which are liberal democracies as being subservient to the United States. They share a lot, but they're also quite prepared to independently put their views forward. And I think both China and Russia have very few allies. The only ally China has is North Korea. And to have a sphere of influence, you have to be liked, or at least you have the ability to coerce. China actually is a very difficult situation in the Indo Pacific, because very few of the countries around it actually like its policies.
So what it's doing right now, almost alienated all the ASEANs. Now, I think we're just about there, Christine, are we not?
Yes, we are, and I have to stand in front of you again. I'm
Please
sorry
do.
about that, but that's a wrap. That is the end of our summer series on geopolitical challenges, and I have to say it really has ended on a real high note. This has been an incredibly high-quality, stimulating conversation, and it's been a treat to have the ambassador surprise us with a visit, and Robert and Rosemary, and of course Sir Don. Just thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating.